Hello, this is Georgina Rose, and welcome to the Darling YouTube channel. On this channel, we discuss mysticism, religion, the occult, and everything on the fringes of esoterica. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about a topic that I've never really seen people discuss, and I'm kind of surprised. It's a topic that I got thinking about a couple months ago. So a few months ago, if you've been following me for a while, I made a video called The Dark Divine Feminine Explained. And what really spurred me to want to make that is that I heard a lot of women online discussing this idea of the dark divine feminine and awakening the dark divine feminine. But as time has passed, I've noticed no one is really discussing the dark divine masculine. What would that be? And so I wanted to talk about it. I did some sort of searching, some researching, and some introspection, and came up with what the dark divine masculine is. And so that's what we're going to explore. So first of all, masculinity is valuable and is metaphysically real. The masculine and the feminine is an idea that comes up in almost every single religious tradition. And this is because the masculine and the feminine coming together and creating that unity is one of the most important metaphysical concepts. On a very literal level, when the masculine and the feminine fuse and come together, it creates life. It brings about the generative force. And that is a human emulation of the divine process. And so this polarity is vital. In all of religion, polarities come up a lot. There are a lot of things that are on this spectrum. And I would say as well, light and dark exist on this polar spectrum. So that would mean, as many people would think, that dark equals evil. And I would say no. Metaphysical evil is absolutely real. I do not deny that. I think metaphysical evil is something that is objectively a thing, right? There is evil in the world. And whatever theological explanation you have for that, it's pretty impossible to deny. But dark and light is a little different, right? Because of course there is good and evil, there is virtue, there is sin. But I think when we say dark and light, we're thinking of a different kind of dichotomy. And that would be on the light side, the sort of loving kindness, where on the dark side we have severity. This makes me think of this idea that we see a lot of mercy and severity. It's in quite a few mystical traditions, and they're used as a pole. And pretty much every system has gods that they assign to these both. And the severity is not evil. Severity is more equivalent to a sort of either like a righteous, godly anger, or a more chthonic idea. And the chthonic is an idea that exists predominantly, I would say, in pagan traditions. And the chthonic relates to the underworld, the dark, the suppressed, the hidden. And I would say that this severity, as in that righteousness, and this chthonic underbelly type thing are the two things that I would say relate to the dark divine masculine. So what is it, and what archetypes does it take on? So I would say the first archetype of the dark divine masculine would be Mars. I actually talked about Mars in my original divine masculine video. And what's interesting about Mars is that Mars represents actually a variety of things, right? Mars represents war. Very obviously, he's a war god. But he also represents strength. And so when we look at what strength can appear in multiple ways, right? There is the strength to stand up for yourself when you're being pushed down, but there's also the strength to raise a village and destroy it, right? And I would say Mars connects to both of these. And so the light masculine within Mars would be this strength and virtue, and this dark would be this raising of villages, this actual war-like element on the literal sense. Because when we talk about war gods, I think in modern life, a lot of people are detached from war, unless you are someone in the military, in which case this is a little different. So when they think of ideas of war, they think of it as like warring between people when you have an interpersonal conflict, or a sort of internal war, right? Like the war of the self, the war against desire, the war towards will, the war against things that hold us back. And those are things that relate to war, but we cannot forget that war gods do also relate to that literal thing. And what's interesting about war is is complicated, right? In certain circumstances, a war is necessary. And so while war is tragic and horrible, there is still that level of necessity. And so these darker traits of the masculine, that is that ability to exert brute force, exert, the strategy of war and all that, is something that can be scary. It is something that is necessary because as a society, we do need that. And so we do need spiritual people who are connected to that and who are unpacking that. Another aspect of the dark divine masculine would be the feral hunt. Let me explain. So in European paganism, there are a lot of gods that relate to this idea of nature, right? And what's interesting about nature is that nature is really complex. I think if we're online a lot, we sometimes forget that there is both scary stuff and beautiful stuff in nature. And sometimes what is beautiful can cross these lines. And in nature, there is, of course, the flowers, the deer, all that stuff, but there is also the lion, there is the bear. And so nature has this dual nature to it on a literal sense, right? And even if we look at the water, right? And this would apply to water gods, right? We've got a beautiful calm creek, a nice swim in the ocean, but there's also the riptide, there is the typhoon. And without these two ends of this spectrum, it would not be an ocean in the same way. Because the thing that's interesting about destruction is sometimes destruction is necessary. There is a necessity for these dark divine masculine things. And on a spiritual level, when we connect them and unpack them, we can learn these mysteries. So when we look at these feral hunt gods, that will be your Pan, your Serranos, there are a lot of them. When we see these spirits, it can be easy to write them off as, oh, that's an evil forest spirit. But if you look at their epithets, there's other things attached to it, right? Let's look at Pan. So Pan is a really complicated spirit because Pan represents a lot of different things. Pan represents lust, he represents madness, he represents frenzy, he represents nature, he represents a lot of things. And all the different epithets of Pan tell a different story. And so while there are epithets of Pan that, if taken out of control, can cause a real problem, there are epithets that are necessary. We need this level of intensity in these nature spirits. In modern life, we are very detached from the food cycle, right? We just buy our food at the grocery store, we take it home, and that's how we relate to food. We forget that these sort of violent impulses within nature are actually part of us. Hunting is still done, right? And so these nature spirits that we can sometimes see as kind of scary actually serve an important purpose, because we do need people who go hunting. We do need this. And that expression is an expression of masculinity. There is a reason why these hunt gods that are this kind of frenzy, frenetic nature hunt gods tend to be masculine. And that is because that is historically something that men did in society and still to this day pretty much do. Now, there is a hunt goddess, that would be Diana, but Diana is a different side of it. So while Diana is the hunt, she is this group. So Diana has her people with her, her virgins, her women of her cult, and even then they are very lunar, which is a different aspect, because as we know, the moon rules emotions, the moon rules intuition. That is a different aspect than this feral, wild hunt panpipe playing that we see from the masculine deities that relate to this stuff. So while they're both nature, they are different archetypes. And that's a thing that I think a lot of polytheists miss. When you look at polytheistic pagan gods, we are looking at spirits with multiple epithets and multiple sides for them. And as well, even one role, like let's say a nature god, can be expressed through different gods in different ways, right? Nature can be many epithets, and many of these dark divine masculine epithets and titles do have a light version and a dark version, because the light and the dark are not necessarily opposite each other. It is different when you are talking about good versus evil, but in this context, dark versus light, it's a little more nuanced. Another thing I wanted to discuss is the idea of if this concept of the dark divine masculine would relate to the cultural concept of toxic masculinity. So I kind of have some beef with this idea of toxic masculinity. I think that there's a real problem with it, mostly because both masculinity and femininity can be expressed in good and bad ways. There is toxicity and there's positivity to both of these things. And so I don't like this term, and I think it has been really kind of manipulated and used to shame masculinity, which is really unfortunate, because masculinity is important for any healthy society to function and is something that is built into so much metaphysical lore and history. So I wanted to put that in there, like, this is not toxic masculinity. That's not what I'm talking about, because masculinity, I think we sometimes think, is only good if it is in this very like soft way. We want to soften it. And I think this is an impulse that a lot of us have, right? We live very cushy, comfortable lives. Most people, not everyone, but a lot of people do. And so they want to really soften spirituality and turn it into something cozy and comfortable. It's like a great example of this is how the idea of a guardian angel was turned from a spirit that you have to work really hard to discover and to guide you into a like ooh-woo soft spirit who just like watches over you and protects you. That's not what it is. Even in Christianity, which I think a lot of pagans, because they read a lot of Nietzsche, kind of write Christianity off as really love and light and following a slave morality, which I would say to some extent Christianity does follow a slave morality. There's a reason why I am not personally a Christian. I think Nietzsche had some good points. But one thing that I think pagans miss is that even within the Christian worldview, there is still this level of complexity within Yahweh, the Christian God. I'm going to use the Christian one for this example. There are a lot of different theories about the three Abrahamic gods. That would be Adonai / Hashem, Yahweh, and then Allah, whether they are the same spirit or three different spirits, that's a conversation to be had, and I think that's a big theological discussion. I could get into that. I can make a video on that at some point, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to separate them. I'm just going to be talking about the Christian context because that is what most people are culturally familiar with, right? There is still this righteousness. When you look at the Psalms, which is a part of the Bible that has a bunch of these little sort of short writings, there are Psalms about healing, but there are also Psalms, and they're called the penitential Psalms, that are essentially about God striking people down. And would that make that God evil, the God that is perceived as all perfect, all good? No, that would be the darker side, but that is necessary because this is the thing. Without any form of spiritual severity or boundaries or harshness, evil is actually allowed to grow. There is a necessity for this severity. And as well, if we only focus on the loving and merciful aspects of the divine, we are missing the whole picture. And I think this idea actually is what Gnosticism kind of comes from. So I am not a Gnostic, but Gnosticism as a spiritual ideology is the belief, and it's one that came out of Christianity. It's considered a heresy, but I don't care. I'm fine with discussing heresies. I'm not a Christian. I don't care if something's heretical or not. I just am curious people's perspectives. But basically what it is that the Abrahamic God is actually a false tyrant. And yes, the world was created in the image of God, and the world has problems, the world has strife, the world has war, the world has suffering. And so that would mean that since it's created in the image of God, God must be imperfect. And Gnostics tend to take it far and say that would make God evil. Valentinian Gnosticism views it a little differently, where the Valentinians argue that God is just flawed, God is not entirely evil, thus the world is flawed, but there is still goodness in it. But regardless, it relates to this idea that means God is entirely evil. And what comes from that is this idea that the material world is evil, right? That everything in the material around us is bad, it's all evil, and the only way to live a fulfilling life, to live a happy life, to live a successful life is to break free of the material and unite with what they call the monad or the source, depending on who you're talking to, which is the true God that is sort of a detached, disembodied God that is the whole of knowledge and knowledge. The whole of knowledge and goodness and whatnot. But you have to break past the material for that. And what I think this has arose from is this idea that the God or gods, depending on your religious perspective, are entirely light. Because this is the thing, severity has a place, but I think a lot of people, when they're like, oh, the gods are good, that means that the problems in the world must debunk this idea and must debunk religion entirely. I counter that. I think that the severity of the world exists for a reason. I think that suffering, I think that struggle, I think that turmoil exists for a reason. I think often what we go through and what we suffer with is part of our development spiritually. In Thelema, a tradition that I've talked about a lot, there's this idea of crossing the abyss. And this is something that happens late in someone's spiritual journey. It's known under other terms in other traditions. I know that if you're really into Jungian stuff, you will know it as the dark night of the soul. And basically what happens is you go through this really dark, painful period where you feel completely detached from the divine. You feel lost, you feel pointless, you feel alone entirely. And you suffer, you go through this pain, and if you are able to come out the other side to break through, you are united with the divine again, and you discover that even in that dark hour, the divine was still with you. This is one of the key mysteries of Western esotericism entirely. Of course, it's a little different if you actually go through with it. I have not gone through with it yet. It's something that people do way in their spiritual maturity. Perhaps I will do it, perhaps I won't. I'm not at that point in my life yet, but that lesson shows something, right? That as spiritual people, we go through this dark night of the soul, we go through it, and then from there, God is still there, God is still finding us, but that darkness is still something that exists, and it is not always a bad thing. Now, to compare the dark divine masculine to metaphysical evil, we have to look at what metaphysical evil is. So metaphysical evil is essentially pure destruction, pure chaos, and it is against the divine. I would say what would make something evil would to make it against the divine. Not dark, not heavy. I wouldn't say a spirit like Kali is evil. I wouldn't even say Pan is evil, which some could argue Pan is, I guess, evil or whatever. Or edgy. That's not what defines evil either, right? Things that are wholly against the divine, wholly against life, right? Things that go against our vitality. Because when I look at all these dark divine masculine things, right? War, passion, suffering, all these things. They're part of life and they go with our development and our growth and our journeys, right? They're part of the cycle of life, the samsara, the death, life, rebirth cycle that we are always and constantly going through, and that the universe is always and constantly going through, because everything is cyclical. Everything is in ages, everything is in cycles. This idea of linearity is one of the biggest modern myths, right? This idea that there is either linear progress or linear decline. Complete nonsense. It is a cycle, and all spiritual traditions pretty much show this, right? There are ages that are good, there are ages that are bad, and they cycle back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And these darker things are part of that, right? They are part of these journeys. They are part of that cycle. They thrust us in and out of ages. And these harsher things like strength, right? We need that martial strength. We even need that warlike strength to continue the cycle and enter into another golden age out of a dark age, for instance. This video is brought in part by Keen. Keen is the largest psychic hotline site in the world. I personally have had a reading with them before, and it was actually really helpful. I was shocked. You can look at the reviews of every psychic on the website, and that's what I did. I picked a psychic with a high review. They also are different prices. They're charged by the minute, and the range really varies depending on what you're getting. They have everything from mediumship reading, twin flame readings, astrology readings, tarot readings, everything you want. And you join the call, you put in your time, and you talk with the advisor, and they'll answer your questions. I was so impressed by it, so you should really check it out. I wouldn't recommend the service if I didn't actually like it, and Keen is really incredible. I had never used a psychic hotline before. I had only seen psychics in person or online with people I actually personally knew, so it was a whole new thing for me. I'd never experienced anything like this, and I was incredibly pleasantly surprised. I also have a special offer for my followers, so check the video description box to see what that is and to access Keen. I would really appreciate if you did. So have a nice day, and let's get back to the video. Now, metaphysical evil, I would say, are things that seek to destroy universe and break vitality and go against life, right? Because fundamentally, we are living creatures and our spirituality is living. Once you are trying to destroy life, destroy the cosmos, something like that, that I would say is true metaphysical evil, right? There was this one Gnostic cult, and this is a really dark example of Gnosticism that existed historically, where essentially what they realized is that the material world is so bad and evil that the only way to find enlightenment is to kill yourself. And I find that horrific. That's tragic. And I think that is an example of metaphysical evil, because at that point you aren't even working with spirits, you aren't working with gods, you aren't praying, you aren't devoting, you aren't doing these things that make up mysticism, because mysticism is the child of discipline, devotion, right? You're devoted to nothing. At that point, it is truly evil, because you're not growing, you're not chasing will, you're not chasing the great work, you're not chasing gnosis, you're not chasing unity. You are chasing destruction and death. And what's interesting about death, because there are some of these dark divine masculine spirits that are related to death. There are many gods of death. These gods of death are not gods of killing people. They are not gods of serial murder. They are gods of the cycle. They are gods of liminality. They are gods of moving you from life to death and to rebirth, because once again, it is a cycle, right? This is the truth of esotericism, right? We are in a life, death, rebirth cycle that is continually spinning and going on and on and on and on. And so these death gods, while they represent death, which is a scary, hard, and dark thing, they are pulling us into the next chapter. They are not death for the sake of dying. They are death for the sake of rebirth. So that would be the distinction. And that is why I would say that the dark divine masculine and metaphysical evil are not the same thing. Now, why would you want to connect to the dark divine masculine? If you are a man, why do you want to do this? Why would that be something you would chase out? The reasoning is that spirituality is often about balance. One of the key ideas of Western spirituality in particular, and it also exists in the East, the idea of the yin yang is an Eastern version of this, but the Western version is that to develop fully spiritually, you need to smash opposites together, and then through their unity, you get growth. And interestingly, this relates to that thing I was saying about masculinity and femininity at the beginning. When masculinity and femininity come together, they create life, they create generation, they create new things, right? And so within us, there are dark impulses and light impulses. And to grow and to evolve spiritually, we need to push them together. And so one thing that's recommended a lot in Western traditions is to work with two different gods that actually contradict each other entirely, that are very different natures. And then by working with them both, you can develop and learn and grow as a person, because balance is important. And as individuals, we are not naturally that balanced, right? We have things that we are good at, we have things that we are bad at, and we have tendencies that are stronger within us than other people. And one great metaphor that this is done through is through humoric medicine. So humoric medicine scientifically is debunked or whatever, but metaphysically, I still think it's a great teaching lesson. So modern alchemy schools actually do still kind of use this. And that is basically that within us, there are humors. And the humors represent various things, right? And a great parallel to these would be to parallel them to astrology, right? Because everyone knows what the planets means, everyone knows what astrology is, right? So let's say that each of the planets and what they represent is a humor. And to become balanced, to become enlightened, you need to balance the humors. So what would you do? You would do something contrary to your nature. You do something contrary to that nature until eventually you've done enough that you as an individual are balanced and even, and then you're in a state of perfection, right? You're moving towards perfection as you balance these out and as you work with the different ones. Which inherently, if we look at the planets, eventually you're going to have to work with, say, Mars or Saturn, which are the malefics or the dark planets. But what do they represent in our lives? Mars is our strength, our passion, our go, our drive, as well as it is that literal war. Saturn is, of course, discipline, boundaries, restrictions, karma, death. But those restrictions and boundaries are important because as individuals, we need boundaries and restrictions. Otherwise, we are going to have a very unhealthy life and have unhealthy life patterns. And so fundamentally, it is about balance. And that is why you would want to work with the dark divine masculine. Now, how would you do this and what advice would I give you? If you want to work with the dark divine masculine, I would say pick a deity that represents a dark epithet that you relate to and that you want to develop in your life. Let's say you're someone who struggles with your masculinity, right? You're trying to develop and be more masculine and you're kind of timid. You don't stand up for yourself, you're passive. So what would you do? You would work with a war god. Pick anyone, pick a war god and start working with that war god and developing your masculinity in this way and going on this journey so that you evolve, you develop, and you become what you are seeking out, and then you have fixed the problem, right? So that would be what you would do. You can do prayers, you can do offerings, you can do rituals, you can even do devotional acts, which is where you do an act and you devote it to that spirit. There are a lot of options for you to explore this. And I think it's very important and valuable. So that is why I wanted to talk about it. So that's it for the video. If you enjoyed this, please like, comment, and subscribe and ring the bell. And if you're subscribed for 93 days, you will meet your holy guardian angel and you will never need to learn about the dark divine masculine. You can support me on Patreon if you want more videos. I give an extra video every month, early access, ritual guides, private meetings, and more on my Patreon. It's really fun stuff. You can also support directly through Venmo. My username is @.darling, or through Ko-Fi. That link is below. You can also find me on Instagram, Twitter, Telegram, TikTok, Substack, everywhere. I'm also on Twitch. I stream once a week. So thank you for watching and have a good night, day, whatever it is, wherever you are.